very happy that this is the first time we cooperate with Ifimes from Ljubljana. And Ifimes has a long time record of working with universities and other institutions around the globe. So it's good that the main organizer is the Ifimes Institute of Ljubljana and the president here. So welcome very much. The topic is an interesting one. We would have expected that actually it doesn't make sense to organize here an event on 75 years of European and global security and human rights systems. But actually, I have seen or heard from many events remembering this occasion. And possibly this is not only because of the COVID-19 crisis, but this is because of all these challenges where we have more questions than answers. And we are no exception here at this place, that we try to teach also our students that there is a challenge to the, okay. So it's not it's the same for us here. We know more about the questions that we should ask about effective multilateral system, and it's difficult to give the answer. And what I enjoy that the organizers have decided to do here is actually to ask three questions, which I think are essential in three panels. First panel, which will be about the legacy. And we tend to forget how this security system was established at the end of the Second World War. And the title of this conference says Europe's collective security and human rights system. But actually, when it was founded, Europe, what was Europe really in 1945? It excluded quite a lot of parts of these important parts of this continent. And even the UN system, as we know, excluded some parts of Europe at the very beginning. And secondly, what about universal? Was it really universal? Was everybody clear that it meant a universal order and that it meant universal human rights? In these 75 years, a lot of people have been working hard to make it universal, to make it also inclusive in Europe. Even Switzerland is now part of the UN. It took quite a long time before that was possible. So you see, the challenges are not the new ones really, but they are the ones that have gone on through these 75 years, and it is good to remind also of the legacy. I say also the legacy of peacemaking in 1945. And the second panel, which I think is the core panel, if I may say so, is about culture. And I'm very happy that from time to time we remind ourselves that actually what we should talk about is education, art, culture, and science and academic cooperation. And we know in the European Union how hard this is because none of the member countries is ready actually to talk together about these issues. They want to be, especially the ministers of culture, but also the ministers of finance, want to keep education and culture in their own remit only and are not ready to open it up for real cooperation. This is one of the big problems of the European Union, but this is beyond what we're discussing today. But culture and cultural differences obviously is a main issue for why the universal system is not working the way that we would like it to work. And the third panel is actually also a very exciting one because it's about the future. The future is not so exciting normally when you use it as a topic, but the organizers decided to do something which might be seen as a challenge to the system of 75 years ago, to the universal system. They want us to give answers to the question, maybe regional cooperation is a better solution in some areas for going forward than aiming for a universal order which is challenged by main players and main actors. So you see, it will be quite a fascinating day, I think. And let me say, answers are difficult to find. This is a process where we are in. And from an Austrian point of view, I could now recount many issues in the last 2 years where even a country like Austria, which normally you would regard to be a liberal, modern, Western, democratic country, is not always following politics of multilateralism in the way that maybe we would expect it to do. Some of our Austrians here have some grinning on their face, so it's understandable that I stop here because I'm only the co-host, but I welcome you heartily and thank you for coming here. Thank you.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. It is a great honor for me to have the opportunity to address you today an international conference on behalf of the organizers, International Institute for Middle East and Balkan Studies, Ifimes from Ljubljana, Slovenia. We are sorry that Ambassador Professor Dr. Ernest Petric is not with us today. Dr. Petric is former president of the Constitutional Court of the Republic of Slovenia and current member of the Venice Commission and the member of International Law Commission of United Nations. Dr. Petric is also the president of Ifimes Advisory Board. I convey to you his greetings with the wish that the conference be successful and useful. I also take this opportunity to thank Ambassador Dr. Emil Brix, director of the Vienna School of International Studies, for collaboration. I wish success to today's conference entitled 75 Years of Europe's Collective Security and Human Rights System. The topic of today's conference is important not only for Europe, but for the whole world. Given that our institute has a special consultative status with United Nations, Economical Social Council of United Nations, our obligation is even greater to deal with such and similar topics. I sincere thanks to all our panelists, and I want the team to share with us the satisfaction of learning at today's conference and to draw useful conclusions for our better common future and security. Thank you.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me and an honor that you invited me to participate in your today's meeting under the title From the Victory Day in May 1945 to the Corona Disarray. I would have liked to accept this invitation, but at the same time, I promised my old friend, the Foreign Minister of Luxembourg, Mr. Asselborn, to present a new book about him. It's exactly the same time, so I concentrate myself on speaking to you via video. I'm born in 1938. That means that I was a boy during the wartime, and I started to go to school in 1944, in September 44, when the last year of World War II was already running. Bombing in Vienna was every week, and sometimes twice or three times a week. And if it happened when I was at school, we had to run in the shelter, but it was much worse when it was during the night. And my mother was terribly nervous and nothing was functioning. My parents and many other people were longing and waiting for the end of the war and the Nazi terror and the time of Hitler and his collaborators. On the other hand, they knew that the end will only come after a military defeat of the German Wehrmacht, and that the battle around Vienna was unavoidable. And this battle in Vienna on the ground came early April 45. 10,000 of people were killed and the destruction was incredible. But then already middle of April, a new administration was built in Vienna. And on the 27th of April, before the end of the war, a new provisional government in Vienna was built and the Declaration of Independence was published. And a new era in our history started, a new democratic era. On April the 30th, Hitler committed suicide, and on May the 8th, World War II in Europe was finished. And it was an incredible big change for all people in the country. Some were followers of the Nazi, and their world was collapsing. Many were victims of the Nazis, and they had new hopes for the time after the war. It was a difficult time. It was a destruction which was incredible, but there was also confidence in the future, in the new future. And the big question was, will people learn from history? Will things become better after the things that happened between World War I and World War II and during World War II? I'm an optimist. I believe that the development from 1945 until today, and these are 75 years, would not have been possible and would not have been so positive if people would not have learned a lot of history. But still, things were complicated enough. At the beginning was the founding of the United Nations in June 1945. The Charter was signed in June 1945. 3.5 years later, in December or November 1948, the famous Human Rights Declaration was published. The first article in this declaration reads, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights." And human dignity is a central point in the Human Rights Declaration. And this is really a new era. It is an incredible document accepted unanimously. The big problem, of course, is to transfer the wording of the declaration in political praxis. And this task is not yet finished. In Europe, the idea of European cooperation and economic cooperation was strong and was supported by Churchill and de Gasperi from Italy and Monet in France and Honoré Spaak from Belgium and many other great Europeans were trying to accept the chance for a united Europe. But there was a big problem of the split between East and West, between the communist world under the leadership of Moscow, to give a geographical reference, and the Western world under the leadership of Washington. Stalin wanted obviously to keep all the territories the Red Army had conquered in the last years of World War II. The Cold War started, and nevertheless in Western Europe the idea of European economic cooperation was growing and developing, and then the Treaty of Rome was accepted between 6 European countries at the beginning of, as we call it today, European Community, after the long development. In 1953, March 1953, Stalin died. This was a shock for the Soviet Union. The fight for the leadership started, and finally Khrushchev was the one who was, so to say, the successor. But He didn't want to copy Stalinism. He wanted to make some changes, some reforms. The Western countries called it Tauwetter, political relaxation, to show that one could negotiate with Russia. They were not so stubborn as Stalin. And the Austrian State Treaty, by the way, from May 1955, was a product, a result of this division. The Russian soldiers left Austria in October 1945, together with all other occupation soldiers, and a totally free and independent Austria was created. Not so in Germany. In Germany, the situation was much more complicated. The antagonism was growing, and you know that the Berlin Wall was built in 1961 as a symbol of the division between East and West. And while on the one side, NATO was founded as a military alliance, on the other side, the Warsaw Treaty was founded also as a military alliance. But the arms race was dangerous for both sides and expensive for both sides. And so in the 70s, the idea of coexistence, of peaceful coexistence, was growing, and it was a success when the Helsinki Treaty of the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe was signed. It was a step in the direction of reducing political tensions. On the other hand, in the late 70s and in the early 80s, China, after the death of Mao Zedong, appeared on the world stage. China, a sleeping giant for so many decades, now was marching to a leading position in world economy and world power. Then came the Big Bang of 1989, the collapse of several communist regimes in Eastern Europe, started by the fall of the Iron Curtain and in particular of the Berlin Wall. And the next step was the collapse, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, while Germany became united and reunited again. The European economic cooperation was expanding from 6 members to 9 to 12, and after the fall of the Iron Curtain, the next enlargement step followed with Austria, Finland and Sweden, and finally in 2004, the enlargement to step by step 27 members. This was the situation at the end of the last century, and then tensions, political tensions, started to grow again. I don't know whether it was really wise to extend NATO to the borders of Russia. I have my doubts. Others say it was necessary. And with President Trump in these days and Xi Jinping on top of China, with the Brexit in Europe, with the coronavirus as a worldwide pandemic, we arrived in the 21st century and in the years just behind us now, in the year 2020. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I have learned in my life that forecasts and prognosis of the future of a country, or the future of mankind, in 99% are wrong and misleading. It is not possible to forecast the future for a long period. What did we know in the year 1900 about 1920. And what did we know in 1920 about 1940, and in 1940 about 1960, etc., etc.? What did we know in the year 2000 about our present problems, our problems from today? So what we can do is to try to be successful on the field of cooperation, on the field of disarmament, on the field of actions against damage in our climate, and in the field of democracy and democratization. I think that the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, are really an incredible positive document. It's a miracle, it's a phenomenon that all members of the United Nations could unanimously accept and support the text on central political goals and issues. I'm now trying to work in the Ban Ki-moon Center in Vienna, and I think that here we also can do something very useful and helpful, namely to support the SDGs and to advocate the SDGs. And that's what I want to tell you in this way, and I wish you every success for your conference. And once again, please excuse that I use modern technologies because I couldn't be on two places at the same time. All the best. Thank you.
I am pleased to address this international conference, which focuses on two of Europe's most important priorities and fundamental values: collective security and human rights. In the past 70 years, the EU was born and grew from a family of 6 founding members to its current membership of more than 500 million citizens. We have built a union that promotes peaceful cooperation, respect of human dignity, liberty, equality, and solidarity among European nations and peoples. And we have proved that EU membership is a powerful tool to guarantee stability and security. The EU project has been vindicated by history. During the current turbulent times, the pandemic has magnified the spread of various types of negative narratives and conspiracy theories against our own cooperation and our own security arrangements. Security policy is grounded in our common values and upholds the rule of law and fundamental rights. In few days later this month, we will present a new EU Security Union strategy to set out precisely the areas where the Union can bring added value to support member states, from combating terrorism and organized crime to preventing and detecting hybrid threats to cybersecurity. Let me be very clear. Security policy cannot be achieved at the expense of our values and principles. Only a few days ago, we celebrated the 75th anniversary of the United Nations Charter. We should use this occasion for a genuine reflection on how to strengthen multilateralism and reinvigorate the functioning of global governance. In the context of widespread challenges to human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, there are now high expectations of Europe to maintain its lead in the promotion of these universal values. For this reason, the EU intends to strengthen our cooperation with the Council of Europe, which plays a crucial role in all these areas, building on its experience of over 70 years. The EU will continue to work to promote effective multilateralism and uphold the rules-based international order, not least in the context of the impact of COVID-19. And that would include the socioeconomic impact on human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, requiring human rights-based responses as they result in better outcomes in beating the pandemic, ensuring non-discrimination, equality, and preserving human dignity. The European Union in itself is very much a peace project and testament of the fact that security can only be truly sustainable when matched with respect for human rights. At the same time, the overall global picture remains mixed and progress has been uneven. The universality and indivisibility of human rights have been seriously questioned by many, even so more in recent times. But it's precisely in this changing global landscape that we, as European Union, remain the strongest supporter of the multilateral system, both politically and financially. We will reinforce Europe's long-standing commitment on this front. The pandemic obviously carries multiple human rights dimensions. It poses particular challenges to the effective exercise and protection of human rights, and is threatening everyone's right to life and right to health across the globe. It puts the resilience and the cohesion of our democracies and societies to the test. But at the same time, this is also an opportunity for Europe, an opportunity to stand up for our values and interests. The EU response to the pandemic is grounded on solidarity, non-discrimination, and fair access to health services for all. Looking ahead, it is clear that new opportunities and new challenges have arisen around us. The accelerating climate crisis has driven millions to demand action. Poverty and war push people to perilous migration routes. In every region, people are finding their voice to speak up about growing inequalities and repressive institutions. Digital technologies offer incredible opportunities, but their impact on human rights can be both positive and negative. And the journey of safeguarding human rights is, of course, far from complete. No country can claim to be perfect, nor does the European Union tend to do. Complacency is not the good advice. Only by working together across different nations, we can achieve real progress, greater freedom, and justice. This is what makes us special in today's volatile and uncertain world. This is what makes us proud to be Europeans.
Dear participants of the conference in Diplomatic Academy, I really want to welcome you, give you a very warm and hearty welcome to all the participants, the panelists, and of course also the director of the Ifimes Institute, Camilla Habsburg. I personally regret very much that I cannot take part at this moment, because in this moment when the conference is starting, I will be in Germany, but I will follow sooner or later the conference by the electronic way. So far, just give it a chance to say a few words to the issue and the topic. I'm very glad that this institute is existing and occupying itself so much with the Balkans and the Middle East states. Why? Because this always used to be a crucial territory, a crucial region, not only for itself, but for the whole of Europe and also the whole of Asia. If we go back to history, we can find out, or specialists have found out, that modern man entered Europe probably on the way and started to settle on this continent from the Danube region. And also afterwards, of course, it always used to be a center of world development and world politics, whether this was during the ancient Greek period, or afterwards the Eastern Roman Empire with Constantinople. Of course, also during the period between the Ottoman Empire and Habsburg interests at the Balkans. And from the 19th century, it also was a field of competition between Austria-Hungary on the one side, Russia, and Turkey at the other side. What we can learn out of history is that this region always was a center of development for the mankind in the whole continent. When this region had peace and stability, almost all the parts of the continent did have peace and stability. And if there was war, then instability also could be seen all over the continent. And insofar, of course, it also was a very hard and very intense experience I had as a Minister of Defense in the years beginning of 1990 and 1991, when after the fall of the Iron Curtain, there was the chance that this region could reunite with Europe when the division between East and West was overcome. But suddenly also there was the outbreak of the war in ex-Yugoslavia. And the question of peace and stability and human rights has not ended since. What we have to learn is that peace and stability need something more than just not trying to start a war. They need a sense and a position, a positive position for human rights and for cooperation. And I think if we try to work very hard on it, we will have a chance to manage also that the Western Balkans that are surrounded by member states of European Union, that they can have a similar development as we can find it now in Northern, Western, Eastern, or Southern Europe. And this should be our goal. But it does not come by itself, but only by hard work. And insofar, I'm very glad that this conference is going on, and I wish you the very best for not only interesting discussions, not only interesting positions, but also a very successful end and result of this conference. In my mind, I will take part with you. I wish you all the best. Have a good day.
So coming back to what Excellency mentioning and President Fischer, so Europe matters, but we shouldn't forget also, let's say, the overall surrounding of Europe, and therefore it takes us with the second speaker to Washington. Steve Clements is a vivid and dynamic guy who knows the inner circle very well. He describes himself. He was my guest some years ago, and I remember that some of the students was naively asking him, "So, what is your political position?" Usually, you don't ask; you try to spot it. Are you a Republican or a Democrat? Then he was giving very very interesting answer. He said, "I'm a radical centrist," which, of course, everybody who deals with the geopolitics understands that the balance matters. So Steve Clements, as I understand, will be with us via Zoom, but we will play his pre-recorded message, which in my mind was excellent one. And Steve was really regretting very much that he was not able to come here. He also liked it, like me. So I feel at home. And one of the reasons why I feel at home, because this was my home some years ago. I will not disclose the years, because I was here together with the vice director of Academy, Susanne Kepler, so you don't disclose ladies' age. But I will just say to those who know that our boss chapter was out of this. So just 2-3 years ago. Okay. So Steve Clements, yeah.
Hi, I'm Steve Clements. I'm editor-at-large of The Hill, a political publication in the United States, and I really regret that I'm not with all of you in Vienna right now. I would certainly much rather be there than where I am. I want to say a certain hello to my good friend Anis, who invited me to join all of you, and also thank my moderator today, Ernest. I'm sorry that I'm not there for you to maneuver during the discussion, and also want to commend the organizers for touching such an important issue as what has happened between the era of World War II and what came after that to the COVID era today, as we find ourselves struggling to find a North Star in what course nations should take and what course essentially the transatlantic relationship should take, if I may put it that way. Let me share with you a few reflections, and I'll try not to be too long-winded because I know there's a crowded panel. First of all, after World War II, when there was so much destruction, and really the United States and its allies, and I mean allies in the broadest sense. Lately, Russia has been objecting to not being included as much in that, and I do include them. But there was a total defeat of Germany and Japan. And as a result of trials there and holding those accountable in their societies for the fascism, the crimes, the murders, and the horrific acts against their own citizens and crimes against humanity, institutions were built, important ones like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Paris in 1948, passed by the UN General Assembly, the establishment of the United Nations itself, other institutions both in Europe and the United States that had global purpose in dealing with the human condition and human rights, but it was rights all around. It was essentially looking at the questions of how economic rights were going to be intermediated and how human rights were going to be preserved, and really a kind of experiment both in Europe and the United States as to what the right DNA of a modern liberal democracy would look like. And that became embedded in our institutions at that time. In my view, and this is controversial, I believe that nations like Japan and Germany were to a certain degree lobotomized at that time. Their military and defense functions, their national security functions, particularly with proactive national security, were suspended in Japan's in a constitution, in Germany's in other ways. And when you look back on those times, it's interesting to remember that not all nations were the same. Japan and Germany were brought back forcefully, in my view, into an American orbit. They were forced and wedged deeply, in Germany's case, in the European economy. And NATO was in part created to wedge American security and American security interests into European interests, but in a way that there could be no rogue nations within Europe, and that there could be a consolidation of interests around the threats that the Soviet Union then represented around the world, and then to some degree China later. But that was the way the game was played in those days. And when you look at the state of those institutions today, they're very wobbly, they're very shabby. When you look at the transatlantic experiment, it looked like it succeeded enormously until it stopped succeeding and working. When 9/11 occurred and Europe came invoked Article 5 and came to the defense of the United States and deployed troops out of area in places like Afghanistan, this was both an important moment in the strength of organizations like NATO, but it was also probably a punctuation point of diminishing return, that these institutions need to be rethought, reconsidered, and recalibrated, that the power players that now guide much of the world need to be reassorted. There's just no doubt that countries like Brazil and India, you could go on and on, are not really included in those power centers, and yet they have enormous stakes in the way global affairs occurs, and there's a lot expected of them, in my view, about what the global commons, how global commons problems should be achieved. So that takes us to today, and I won't dwell on President Trump and this unique moment of pugnacious nationalism in the United States, but I think it's obvious to everyone, at least it is to Americans sitting here in Washington, D.C., that a substantial portion of the American political crowd wants to disentangle it from the institutions that it helped build. It wants to withdraw from organizations like the World Health Organization. It has declared that it will not be part of the Paris Climate Accord, that it will not support certain UN institutions. And it is clearly obsessed with a moment of pugnacious sovereignty, and it looks at these international deals as a threat to that sovereignty. I should say I completely disagree with that perspective, but it would be a mistake not to understand that that impulse in the United States right now is not just limited to Trump, but that it could have some resilience in American politics down the road. And I think we've seen in many Eastern European countries in particular, Hungary really stands out, but you're in Austria and they're all around you. There are others that have tilted towards illiberalism and to the trappings of what looks like autocracy. And liberalism in general, I think, is in danger in certain parts of Europe. And I think that those that had once wanted to be part of Europe, like Turkey, are swimming daily in illiberalism and autocracy in ways that are very disconcerting. And so there's a real moment out there where the institutions that we built to stand resilient against the trappings of fascism, the trappings of autocracy, the undermining of minority rights, these are coming undone and they don't work as well right now. And I think it raises an interesting question of what we will need to do to kind of relive or kind of look back at how we come back from that period after World War II, the devastation, to something that was great. And now we have COVID-19. We have a great pandemic. It's a very unusual pandemic because it not only attacks our health, our physical well-being, and creates crisis, it attacks our societies. It is, and I must tip my hat to the Europeans that have managed the COVID crisis so much better than we Americans have. A large number of Americans did not take the threat seriously, did not distance themselves in ways that would preempt the spread of the virus. And we're going to have to see where this goes. But it has caused huge economic impacts. We have seen the virus caused in the United States more than 44 million unemployed. The impacts of that are going to be long-term and consequential. We've also seen the COVID virus hit communities of color and those in lower socioeconomic groups in the United States. And so at a point where, as we've seen the murder of a man named George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota, sprung into a global set of protests about race and identity in societies around the United States. So there is a sign of a kind of pushback against those that would not take liberalism in the classic European sense for everyone very seriously. Liberalism and freedom from harassment, from detention, from police abuse, from socioeconomic neglect. And I think that is part of this time as much as the COVID crisis is. And at least in the case of the United States, we are not at a moment right now. We'll talk in another 4 months after the presidential election. Maybe things will shift. But at least right now, the United States has chosen not to be the kind of leader that it has been in the past. It did not step forward in the COVID crisis to help become a broker of strength and benefit and health support to nations around the world. We can find here and there where we may have done something, but nothing on the scale. That's one of the biggest comparisons between what occurred after World War II and what occurred today. But there's no one that has filled that void. China, with its mass diplomacy, I think, failed miserably. China still, nonetheless, has a network of developing nations that it depends on, and which I think China is tuned into and is working to kind of think in network terms about its part of the world that it wants to control and influence. The United States right now, it's more likely for an ally of the United States to get kicked in the teeth than to be consulted in serious ways about these major transnational problems today. And I think that's a substantial problem. So when you come to your core question of 75 years of these institutions, I'd love to give you a rosy outlook that we will somehow spring back to that. But I think fundamentally, the trust that America helped achieve, that it planted, that it earned from allies around the world by being both a security guarantor, but also becoming, creating and spreading economic opportunity. I think we become a much more zero-sum world. I think to a certain degree, the United States has become a competitor with its allies, a serious competitor with its allies, and the notion of shared interest has diminished. I don't mean to say it's completely gone, but it would be a mistake not to look at the fact that that environment has deteriorated greatly, and that if you want to see the values of human rights reasserted, the importance of them, if you want to see common security threats reappreciated and considered, if you want to look whether it's terrorism or it's violent weather as a result of climate change, or whether it's the question of how do we manage the tensions in certain parts of the developing world that are very resource strapped, or how do we handle a pandemic and its uneven impact across the world. There are many nations that simply cannot afford to protect themselves in this time. And even when a vaccine is developed, and I think it will be developed, then we're going to have a law of the jungle for a while as to vaccine may be distributed. And so I find all of this unfortunate and very antithetical to the kind of world that we built after World War II. So I don't want to be completely negative. I think one of the ways you get back into a better area is being very realistic, with a cold, steel-eyed look of the world as it is. And right now, the world is a harsh place without much leadership, and the leadership comes in pockets on an ad hoc basis. Maybe out of this, and maybe because of the pandemic and the COVID-19, we'll get back to that point eventually where nations, even the United States, realize that going alone creates much weaker and lesser outcomes than going together with allies, and that the maintenance of those allies is not to have an ad hoc relationship with them where you just go order in one day an operation with Austria on some problem, or England or France or Germany, and the next day you say no to them. That to a certain degree, alliances and the trust in them requires an element of always being there for one another, or at least being there most of the time. And right now, that is not happening. We have a presidential election coming up, as I mentioned, in November of this year, and we are going to have a contest about what the core values of the nation are. Is it going to be pugnacious nationalism that detests the international system and that does not believe in these core values of human rights and the strength that comes from institutional arrangements with like-minded allies? That is going to be on the picture. That is what I think Joe Biden is going to represent. Donald Trump is going to represent a rejection of those, a rejection of asylum seekers, a rejection of human rights concerns for people other than Americans. And I don't think there is a market for that in the U.S. political marketplace, but it does not sell very well globally. And that is where we're at. I wish I had a good answer and a kumbaya answer that it would all come out well, but I don't believe that that's the way we're going to get there. We need to understand that the stakes are high right now, and I am an objective journalist. I am one who deals with the Donald Trump administration every day as it is, but I would nonetheless, on a personal basis, would like to see America work on a shared values basis with other key allies around the world on a more consistent basis. But the only way to get back to that and to reform and revitalize the institutions that all need reform to be there is that we need to realize that we in America will be much, much worse off without those institutions and without those partnerships. And so I hope this is a useful contribution to the dialogue and discussion in Vienna today. And again, I'm happy to interact with anyone by email or digitally after, but I commend you for this and thanks so much for listening.
So from digital Washington back to plenary in Vienna, I have a great pleasure to announce the first analog speaker now. That's Professor Pelinka. He's very outspoken. He's well read, well not only then understood, but very well read, and he inspired generations, not only Austrian students, but also in Hungary as well. So without further ado, Mr. Pelinka, thanks for coming, and so is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, this conference is about the legacy of 1945 and 1946, the first year signifying the unconditional surrender of the armed forces of the Greater German Empire, and 1946 standing for the Nuremberg war trial. I think it's important to remember this starting point. Without the unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945, I doubt we could sit here and discuss really and academically the future of an unfinished business, the future of an integrating European community and an integrating European Union. Especially for me, and the chairman has also declared his political conviction, I declare I am a European who happens to be an Austrian. And as an Austrian, we have also never forget that we exist as a democracy within Europe because of the victory of the Allied powers. Our friends, looking back, have not fought as Spanocki very elegantly put, in the wrong uniform, the wrong war, the wrong places. Our allies had been those who were fighting in the uniforms of the United Nations, as they were already calling themselves in 1940. So we have to thank the United Nations for being free and democratic. In Nuremberg, there was a new beginning concerning a new, not only international legal system, but also the beginning of a new design of a universally accepted concept going beyond national sovereignty. What is, I think, the essence of European integration is to go beyond unlimited national sovereignty. The defining other of the European Union is nationalism. And going beyond nationalism means going towards a unified Europe. In Nuremberg and 1 year later in Tokyo, crimes against humanity as a basis of the decisions, crimes against the humanity were seen more than just war crimes, especially individual responsibility, despite claiming following orders, was a decisive point the judges in Nuremberg and Tokyo used. And also, of course, crimes against humanity were also seen to deal with the unprecedented crime of the Holocaust. This was a starting point when 1945 allowed the beginning of European integration. Nuremberg gave the European integration process a certain quality, a new quality. Europe was able to learn. And this is, I think, the biggest success, the capacity to learn from the past. Europe was able to learn from the decades, the most devastating decades in European history. The decades of 1918 until 1945, or 1914 until 1945. And while in 1918, 1919, Europe was unable to learn, beginning in 1945, Europe was able and willing to learn. One learning was included into what we call the Jean Monnet process, that peace must not be built on punishing the loser, but embracing the loser and not defining your enemy as a nation, but as a political system which can be overcome, which has been especially the case with Germany and Japan. Germany is not Germany, Japan is not Japan. In a certain way, Austria is not Austria. And Europe has become a different Europe due to this learning process. The Jean Monnet design was based on the marriage of idea and interest. The idea was always here. Europe should be one, but it was never become one Europe. Not under Charlemagne, not under Napoleon, not to speak of later dictators. But Monnet was able to conclude there is an economic interest. It's in the interest of the French economy that Germany prospers. It's in the interest of the German economy that the French economy prospers. It's a win-win situation. And this is a basic strategy, the design of Jean Monnet. And this has been the beginning, but still unfinished, process of European integration. From the European coal and steel community to the single market. And when we speak of the cooperation between neighbors, the single market, the European single market means Vienna is not more a neighbor of Graz than it is a neighbor of Bratislava. There is no national economy within the European single market. There's a European economy. And this, of course, leads also to the unfinished business of deepening. This is the topic that Europe is an economic giant, but a political dwarf. It's a basic challenge for the future of Europe to develop its potential to become a political player in the interest of world peace, in the interest of balancing the world on the same level that the United States and China and the Russian Federation, and I would also add India are. This is missing. Part of this integration process has been widening and deepening. The community of 6 became a community of 27, and in a certain way, it's nearing its end. Of course, there's consensus. The West Balkan states are invited and will become, in the hopefully not too far away future, member of the European Union. But then an end is already in sight. Turkey has decided it will not join, and Russia has decided from the very beginning it will never join the European Union. So widening is nearing its logical final point, but deepening, the other logic, is the unfinished program. And the two most important and most visible deficits in this process of widening is immigration and the common foreign and security policy. The single market allows the four freedoms, but the access to the single market is still within the sovereign competence of any member state. And the logic of the single market would lead to a European constitutional decision about immigration, about asylum rights, and the national power to decide who could enter the single market should, in the logic of the single market, should make place for a European order, a European legal rule, who is allowed to enter the single market, who is a member of the European Union. It should not be up to Estonia, Hungary, or Portugal to decide about it. It should be up to the European Union. This is also an aspect concerning the common foreign and security policy, which is enshrined now for 26 years in the European de facto constitution, the Maastricht Treaty, but it's still almost unknown. Just in Austria today, we discuss a new design for the Austrian defense policy and have not heard any word that Austria is obliged to design its defense policy as a European security policy. This is out of the discussion. I think it's a scandal. And this is the same in other cases. But in Austria, at the moment, I think a provocation, I would say, is that the government and the opposition don't see the Austrian defense policy as a European affair. That we are not challenged by a potential invasion by Switzerland or Slovenia, it's obvious. But we are challenged by a European security policy, which does not exist as a common foreign and security policy. Let me come to an end. Is there an alternative to deepening? I think, yes, there is an alternative. That is falling back to the Europe before 1945. It's the only alternative. If we have overcome the devastating decades of the first half of the 20th century, Europe must go on. Europe must become deeper. Europe must become not only multilateral, but more supranational. I know there are enough interests opposing this. And Donald Trump is not only an American phenomenon. We have Trumpism in Europe also. We have Donald Trumps with a European face. But we have learned, and we should go on learning, and remembering what has happened in 1945 should be enough incentive to go on with a deepening process of the European Union. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Professor Palinka. I think we will have still opportunity to come back to some of the excellent views you raise up. So now we go back to digital. It's my pleasure to announce Professor Novak, who is a champion of, let's say, of professorship on human rights. I still recall freshly, it was 93 when the so-called Menschenrechts conference was organized, and this was his big, let's say, a big opening to the world stage. It was, I think, the government of Franz Wernicki, and the foreign ministry was in charge, was Alois Mock, I think, at that time. And then, let's say, to the outside world, the name was very largely popping up. So Professor Novak is with us via Zoom. Good morning. Professor, you have your 10 to 12 minutes, please. Good morning.
Yes, good morning to everybody. And I'm again sorry that I cannot be with you directly, but I made originally. And can you hear me well?
More than enough.
Sorry?
It's
Yes.
Yes,
We
okay.
hear you. You feel
perfect.
excellent.
So I originally had a video because I couldn't be at that time, but now at least I can join you so that we also can have some discussion afterwards. As you will not be surprised, I will try to look at these 75 years after World War II from a human rights lens, both in relation to the United Nations and also to Europe. And I distributed the speech in writing so I can be more succinct today. Now, the United Nations was created in response, and it was a very decisive response to the Great Depression, the rise of fascism, World War II, and the horrors of the Holocaust. And it aims at creating a new world order, never again, which is based on three pillars: international peace and security, development, and human rights. Peace and security means, in the words of Franklin D. Roosevelt, that all people should have a right to live in freedom from fear. It means also freedom from violence, freedom from war. And for the first time in history, war was actually prohibited under the United Nations Charter. Development means freedom from want, freedom from poverty. And again, it's the first time that it's a main objective of the international community to work towards prosperity and the eradication of poverty. And it was also for the first time that human rights were seen as a legitimate international concern. And as Tony Pellica already has said, the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials were also a premiere, that for the first time the main perpetrators of the worst crimes, the worst human rights violations, war crimes and crimes against humanity, were put on trial in order to show that also in the future that should not be unpunished. During the time between 1946 and 48, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drafted, and it was only thanks to this anti-fascist consensus at that time that they achieved a historic compromise, a synthesis between two antagonistic concepts of human rights: the Western concept of civil and political rights and the socialist concept of economic, social, and cultural rights. And in Article 28, the Universal Declaration promises a new international and social order where everybody should be able to enjoy all those different human rights. Now then the time of the Cold War came, and in human rights terms, it was the United States that actually forced a decision on the General Assembly to say, no, we are not treating those two sets of human rights on an equal basis. We split them again into two international covenants. And that had a very lasting effect on these ideological debates between the West and the socialist countries, partly also the global South, during the time of the Cold War on human rights. At the same time, it was the time when many different treaties were actually drafted and codified, adopted as legally binding, which are today more or less universally accepted and ratified. Now, in Europe, there were various ways, as we heard, of course, the European communities, in order to prevent another war on the basis of economic integration, but also the Council of Europe, which has not yet been mentioned as a truly European, at the beginning a Western European organization based on the European values of a pluralist democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. And the flagship of the Council of Europe is and has been at that time and remains today the European Convention on Human Rights of 1950 and the European Code of Human Rights. However, the backside is it's a purely Western document. It's a document on civil and political rights. And economic, social, and cultural rights were, from the very beginning, sidelined in the Council of Europe and in the European understanding of human rights. For instance, in Austria, we still have no economic, social, and cultural rights as part of our constitutional human rights. On the other hand, that was the time, so the first 30 years after 1945, when thanks also to the Marshall Plan, but thanks to a strong economic growth and reconstruction, also the social welfare system in Europe was established. And that was possible because of economic growth, but at the same time, an economic policy based on John Maynard Keynes of state intervention, redistribution, and social welfare, which also means, if you look at the book of Thomas Piketty, or books, that economic inequality did not rise at that time. So you could combine economic growth with redistribution and economic equality. Then 1989, which was mentioned already several times, the Velvet Revolutions, the end of the Cold War, opened a historic window of opportunity to now finally do what was not possible during the time of the Cold War, to really now implement a new world order based on democracy, human rights, the rule of law, and development. I think the World Conference in Human Rights in 1993 was an expression of this positive attitude, so that for the first time, really, also the states of the Global South, including China and others, accepted the universality of all human rights, but at the same time, the Western states also accepted the equality, independence, and divisibility of all human rights, meaning that economic, social, and cultural rights should be treated equally to civil and political rights. There were many other new developments in the 1990s. The Security Council, for the first time in its existence, became operational. We have seen that even Chapter 7 actions were taken in order to prevent or stop armed conflicts like the occupation of Kuwait by Iraq, but also internal armed conflicts and humanitarian disasters and human rights disasters in Somalia and other countries. Also the post-conflict comprehensive peace building missions, transitional administrations like in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in Timor-Leste, and in other countries, including the Kosovo. So also the Security Council, for the first time after Tokyo and Nuremberg, established ad hoc criminal tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda that finally led to the International Criminal Court in 1998. On the European side, we had the Council of Europe very quickly opening. It was originally a Western European organization against fascism, Spain, Portugal, later Greece, but also against communism. And with the fall of communism, it immediately opened up, and most of the former communist states in Central and Eastern Europe joined very quickly. Of course, for many of them, it was also a first step to join the European Union or NATO. And as Heinz Fischer already has said, this was not always done in a very well coordinated manner with the Russian Federation, which then later also led to certain conflicts, as we have seen in Georgia or in the Ukraine. The Council of Europe also developed its system much further. The European Court of Human Rights in 1998 was established as a single court, as a full-time court, and it hands down thousands of judgments every year in relation to all the 47 member states of the Council of Europe. Belarus is the only state that is not a member. The death penalty had to be abolished. So it was a major step forwards. And the UN also and the European Union, of course, was founded. So the purely economic integration moved to a political integration of Europe with a common currency, etc. The EU Charter of Fundamental Rights in 2000, even at that time, the idea was strong to have a European constitution. That means a step towards a federal state or a federation of Europe. So despite, of course, the two genocides in Rwanda and in Srebrenica, nevertheless, the 1990s can be seen as a decade where a lot of progress was achieved. However, in 1989, there were also other major events, the birth of the World Wide Web, of the internet, but also the Washington Consensus, in which the international financial institutions switched from first the economic policy of John Maynard Keynes to that of the Chicago School of Neoliberalism. And that, of course, also digitalization, globalization under the very strong economic growth of neoliberalism also led to, as I said, economic growth, prosperity, eradication or at least a strong reduction of poverty in many parts of the world, in particular in China, but also India and other Asian states. But I would say, at the other hand, these neoliberal economic policies had more negative consequences that we see today when we say the world is in disarray. It's based on three main pillars: privatization, deregulation, and minimizing the role of the state. Privatization went very far, so that even core functions of the state, whether it's the health system, the social security system, the pension system, but also education, were privatized, but also in the field of civil and political rights. Think about privatization of the police, the administration of justice, the military, prisons, etc. So outsourcing to private military and security companies it was really the core functions of the state that were tackled. If you think about Max Weber, what the monopoly of the use of force by the state is put in question with this privatization. Now, minimizing the role of the state also meant not only that social security and social welfare was cut down, but it also did lead to fragile and failed states. That means that when the state is absent, then others take over, non-state actors, whether it's transnational corporations, global financial markets, but also armed groups, organized crime, terrorist groups. And the deregulation of, in particular, the global financial markets led to many negative aspects of speculation, tax evasion, also corruption, but also directly led to the collapse or the problem of the banking system and the financial global crisis of 2008. And certainly also the acceleration of the climate, of the global warming and the climate crisis has to do with this very, very neoliberal economic policies, that environmental destructions. Think about the deforestation in the Amazon and other areas. But also economic inequality was very, very quickly rising after the 1980s. And that is really undermining the social coherence of our societies. It is undermining the basic democratic values. And that, of course, creates insecurity, leads to populism, nationalism, new authoritarianism, and that is also undermining multilateralism. Now, that was a little bit the situation, the world in disarray when COVID-19 and the corona epidemic started in the beginning of this year. And we can certainly say that our world was not well prepared. But if we look, and of course it's a little bit too early still to draw really conclusions, but I think at the first sight, those states that were the most neoliberal states, if you so wish, whether it's the United States, but also the United Kingdom, Brazil, and others, seem to be most hard hit by this pandemic. We also see that in Europe, those that were cutting down the public health system and the social security system most, also including Italy, where I'm based today. So I'm say that really, unfortunately, Italy, but also Spain, the United Kingdom, were doing much worse than those states, including Austria, Germany, the Nordic states, where the public health system, the social security system, are kind of still functioning, although also they had been cut down to some extent. What we are learning, and I try to see that now positively, is that we need again the state. So even those politicians that have said capitalism or private market economy players are much better to solve certain crises and problems than the state, now realize that we need a well-functioning, well-organized state in order to deal with these global challenges. And it's not only pandemics, it's also other disasters. We have more and more also human-made disasters. It's the climate crisis, migration, etc. There are so many global challenges that we need, again, that the state is actually regulating the economy and not the economy regulating the state. And the COVID crisis showed it's possible. It was almost a total lockdown in order to protect the right to life and the right to health of individuals. Our other human rights were very much restrained, and the economy as well. So to learn that it's possible to have more confidence also in the regulating powers of states, but also regional and global organizations. I mean, the World Health Organization was now criticized very much, but on the other hand, it was also instrumental to provide the necessary data and also take action against the spread of the coronavirus. So many people feel there is something fundamentally wrong in the way how we are living, and there might be a positive incentive for changing not only our habits but also changing the European also world order. Now, what are the main lessons that we should and can draw? And I see that very much in an optimistic way. Certainly, in order to deal with these challenges, global challenges, we need to strengthen the regulatory functions of the state and intergovernmental organizations vis-a-vis the economy. We need to replace the neoliberal economic policy with, again, a more socially oriented market policy and one that is environmentally sustainable. We need to strengthen multilateralism, and in that sense, the European Union, and we have now the new presidency of Germany with very ambitious aims, the European Union might play, again, a pioneering role. First of all, it would mean that we have to strengthen again the European Union, which is now weakened after the Brexit and other attacks on the European Union. Certain competencies need to be transferred from member states to the EU institutions. It's social justice. The social pillar needs to be much stronger. but also public health, environmental protection, asylum and migration policies need to be, the EU needs to be strengthened in that sense, but also in its external policies, in its policies in international organizations, whether it's the World Trade Organization or the World Bank or the IMF, so that the EU could become a pioneer also in international multilateral fora for fighting the climate crisis, for implementing the Paris Agreement, for social welfare policies, etc. And the third area is, and Tony Bellinger said, the Russian Federation said from the very, very beginning that they would never join the European Union. That might have been so, but I think in order to strengthen Europe, we need again to get the Russian Federation stronger into European politics. In the moment, it is a very negative situation, but that needs confidence building from both sides. It's not only that the Russian Federation alienated itself from Europe, it was also the other way, and from the West, or from the West. There are so many frozen conflicts. Nagorno-Karabakh, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Transnistria, but also Kosovo, perhaps even the Republika Srpska, need the Russian Federation in order to be solved. You cannot solve them by any kind of military force, but only by confidence building. So that's for me the kind of the main conclusions. Also in the Council of Europe, which is the only truly pan-European organization, with Belarus as the only country that is currently not a member, where we also have to take economic, social, and cultural rights more seriously. And that means, and the question was a little bit, is the anti-fascism the building block for a pan-European future? Certainly, yes, but I think it's no longer the main building block. I think it should be a more positive narrative, and that's the social welfare state, environmental sustainability, and also, as Heinz Fischer said, the Sustainable Development Goals are an excellent blueprint what we need to achieve in the next 10 years, in this decade, and they are very close to the European values. So again, Europe might take the lead in global politics on implementing the Sustainable Development Goals together with the Paris climate goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Please stay with us. I just sent you on WhatsApp a couple of photos to see that your written speech has been distributed here and well read while you've been talking. Thank you so much. Let's move on. So the next speaker is a gentleman who has a real European identity. He comes from Britain, but also from Italy. So it's Zeno from King's College. So floor is yours. You have your 10 to 12 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. I will stick to the 10 minutes assigned. Thank you, and thanks for inviting me. In my work, I focus a lot on US-China relations, especially over the last few months. And there was a big discussion about whether COVID originated in the US or whether it was caused by the US or by China, whether it favored the US or whether it favored China. But as Joseph Stiglitz said, for example, this is not about US and China. This is not where we need to look for the winner. But I think the winner is, or one of the winners are those big transnational corporations who master the infrastructure, the space of the internet. Because in the post-COVID world, our lives are increasingly, we live our life increasingly on the internet. This is a bit of a paradox because at the same time we have realized that with COVID we need more state protections because we cannot expect the market to provide for certain needs. This is what economists call market failures, for example. And so with these interventions, I want to touch on some points that have already emerged from the discussion And I guess my aim is to stimulate some reflection on rebalancing the relationship between economic interest and human rights. But nowadays we should also speak of social rights. Who spoke before me said that they are equally important, and I agree. And also want to stimulate some reflection on the negative implications of a way of life that is based on quick gains, the negative implications it has on strategy. Strategy is important, although we are not military, so we don't think in strategic terms, but we need to start to think again in the long term, 20, 50 years down the line. And I think this is one of the lessons of the mistakes that we have seen with COVID. So just to provide some context, the Trials of Nuremberg, as it was mentioned, was successful in many ways in bringing great powers together, in leading to new tribunals and conventions, and in sentencing authoritarian regimes and war criminals. But most importantly, it was a moment in which humanity came together and sought to rebuild a new international order based on shared values, which are universal. And this is a word that we have already heard during the previous presentations. I want to stress the fact that that universalism was contained a tension. It wasn't just the universalism of human rights. It was also, there was also an economic universalism, the universalism of capitalism. And so also on the one hand, we had this universalism of shared values, those values that we find in the Union Charter, freedom, human dignity, democracy. But on the other hand, there was capitalist universalism, which was about creating a global economic space for business. So it was a Janus-based universalism in the sense that the logic of capitalism needed to succeed. It needed this relationship with the logic of human rights. And human rights were important in order to overcome decolonization, but also to put an end to total war. This Wilsonian idea of ending all wars, not just World War I, not just World War II, but all wars, in order to have a stable global economic order where business can prosper. So I think that this tension is also affecting, is also undermining the European Union in a way, which was born after World War II. So on the one hand, in the European Union, we find we have a charter, and the EU contributed to the preservation of cultures and traditions of different nations and members of the EU. But on the other hand, the EU, as we have heard, has furthered the neoliberal agenda of deregulation and financialization. And we have seen this after the Great Recession of 2008, but also specifically after the COVID pandemic. There is a tension, and what I want to highlight is that probably we have to rebalance this relationship between human and social rights and economic interest, because it seems to me that economic interests are trumping, are undermining, are overshadowing political and social rights. We have seen this in two occasions in particular. Firstly, when in the middle of the pandemic, there wasn't any coordination, any effort to coordinate a response against the pandemic, and yet there were a lot of energies spent discussing the mechanism for European stability. And then other examples are the fact that Italy and Spain, they saw the pandemic coming, but they were very slow to react, while even worse, probably Sweden, the UK, the US, they didn't even want to talk about a proper lockdown. And so we've seen many people that were dying, health systems were under pressure, and we've realized that COVID kills more than a normal influenza, but it seems that to many people is acceptable. So I wonder whether it is acceptable because it kills old people or vulnerable people. I don't want to say that we are going back to eugenics, but certainly if we look at the crisis of 2008 and the pandemic crisis, there is some sort of social and biological Darwinism coming back. So if you're strong, you go ahead, you survive. If you're weak, you perish, either biologically or economically. And this is the first point of my speech. The second point is more about strategy, as I said at the beginning. I think the COVID pandemic has unveiled this limit of a society that is increasingly concerned with quick gain, with economic gains. And this is the lack of a strategic vision for the future. We don't plan long term, we don't think long term, and then a small bacteria can mess up our way of life. We are too focused on ephemeral and short-term, short-lasting needs. And so I want to share with you my experience with, that I've had with the military. I've worked with the military for 4 years now, and I've learned a lot. And they have an interesting approach to strategy. So they talk of strategy as science, but also of strategy as art. So if we look at COVID-19 from the point of view of strategy as science, we see that the West wasn't prepared in terms of having a plan, and it wasn't prepared in terms of having the resources to deal with the pandemic. So we didn't have enough masks and ventilators. So I think this requires us to rethink our economic policies and maybe advocate for a return of a developmental, more interventionist state. During the Cold War, we used to stockpile, we had resilience, but of course nowadays nobody wants to stockpile masks because until a pandemic comes, they don't have any, there's no value, there's no profit, there's no interest in stockpiling masks, for example, or ventilators. In terms of strategy as art, in terms of being creative, I've seen very little ideas around. So some countries just didn't do anything about COVID, like the UK or the US. So I think they really lack of ideas. Other countries like Spain and Italy, all they could do it was going for the safest option, just pushing the button of the lockdown. I didn't see any ability of being creative, of improvising, of thinking forward. And I think, for example, we could have interacted more with other countries, especially Asian countries, who had they could have shared, we could have borrowed from their experiences and maybe applied their experiences to the Italian context, the Spanish context, and so on. I'm approaching the end of my intervention. Strategy is also about, it's not just about art and science, but it's also about the way we live, modus vivendi, way of life. So it's about being healthy. This is very important when it comes to COVID. Once I've heard an American general complaining about the lack of physical shape of US militaries. I thought it was a bit of an exaggeration, in fairness, because wars nowadays are not as they used to be. They're not physical anymore. But I took this article to my students and we had a chat about it. I have to say I changed my mind after leaving this time of crisis, leaving the pandemic. I think if we were a fitter society, if we were a society who had a healthier diet, a society that places more emphasis on sport, many people would have survived. Because we know that COVID kills people with certain vulnerabilities. And thinking about Mediterranean countries, we used to be the healthiest in the world, and I read from statistics that our health has worsened. It is not just about our health system, but it's also about the fact that our diet, our workout activities, the time we spend on these things, it's subordinated to our jobs, to the fact that we need to make a living. So we need a lifestyle that prioritizes healthy diet and workout. It sounds banal, but I think it's critical. It means thinking strategically. So just to conclude, I think a country without a strategy, and I've seen many countries without strategies, is a country that is vulnerable to foreign powers, is vulnerable also to foreign external events. And I think the West has taken a lesson, not only from China. I mean, China, I would never compare the kind of economic resources that China has compared to Italy, for example. But even from states like South Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, and these are countries that probably most of my fellow citizens don't even know much about. So just to conclude, the lesson really is we need to rethink the role of the state and the way it manages some of the strategic sectors of our society, starting from health, if you want, but there's not just health. There is energy, there is food, and other areas of concern. And we need a political class that gives us some vision for the future, not just a vision for the next 3 or 5 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zeno. Also, thank you for keeping the limit. We will still have some time. I understand that Tim Clements is also with us now on Zoom because it's early morning in Washington. But before we go to question and answer period, and we are getting some interesting questions also from our digital audience, I have a pleasure to announce the last speaker, and I'm very happy that we have an issue. So from Director of Ifimes, President Fischer, so practically every speaker was not only mentioning EU, but talking and referring and discussing about the EU. But what we didn't touch much is the UN. And again, that puts us back to Austria and to revise, or what Professor Zeno mentioned, we need a strategy, long-term thinking. So there was at a certain point of time, there was a government which was really, in a way, controversial, but did some things in a very long perspective, excellent for Austria. This was the government of Chancellor Kreisky, who managed to bring actually and to create Vienna, let's say, as the third principal seat of United Nations. So among the other bodies, and I'm very sorry that the new head of the UN office is not this morning with us. It's a charming lady who's new in town from Egypt, that she's not coming here today. But what is important for those of you who are not related much to the UN, it's as I said, the third principal secretariat after New York and Geneva, but it hosts very interesting setting here, which is dealing with the so-called what we now in a new speech or in a sexy way, crispy way, call it asymmetric threats. And this is the former ODCCP, or now ODC, which deals with the drugs and crimes. And they are very fundamental instruments that have been created here in Vienna. I must mention also related to Italy, but more to Vienna, because the work has been done here by that time Director Arlacchi. It's a so-called Palermo Treaty system. And before that, it was the Convention on the drugs and precursors, the chemical precursors to come to narcotic drugs. And finally, I think it was already Costa, the director, who came after Arlacchi. Then we had an instrument on corruption. And that finally, a long introduction, that brings me to our last speaker, Ambassador Stolzer. I'm very happy that he is here. We have a unique also setting here. It's not in Vienna itself, but it's in a charming place next to Vienna. It's Luxembourg. They have excellent ice cream if you don't like Academy and Ayasa. So it's an academy, actually it's a school. It's a facility for anti-corruption. So floor is yours. Thank you for coming with us today. And sorry for the long introduction. It's more for the audience, for our digital audience, to give them a bit of the context. Your 10 to 12 minutes is yours now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having invited a practitioner after the academics in the previous interventions. So I will take the issues from a more practical point of view, from a practitioner's point of view. First, it's great to see faces, unmasked faces after all these times of social isolations, albeit with social distancing, which makes us aware that the situation has changed and there might not be a way back into the status quo ante, that we have been torn out dramatically just 3 months ago and unexpectedly. Now, I'm not going to talk about, I don't have a remembrance of 75 years back. This is my first day, by the way, as a retired public servant of Austria after a career in the service of the public common goods, I can say, in, with, and for the United Nations. And instead of living back now in my retirement, I just took on the maybe biggest challenge I have ever taken on in my professional life. You referred to it, but I will refer to it only in the last few minutes of my intervention. I don't have a written speech, but I have more to say than I can fit into the time allocated to me. So I'll try to tackle where we are and maybe where we want to go to in a few minutes. When I look at the world today, it seems to me that we are stumbling from one crisis into the other, which is always becoming deeper and deeper. You know, the media tell us that every year we live through is becoming hotter than the previous one. We don't take note of it. The last crisis, which is still in our screen, is the one 2008, which was the financial, economic, social crisis that we never really came out of. So the phase between 2008 and 2020 is an interval where we have been trying to develop a new narrative. You know, after 2008, some of the myths that had directed our life until then were shattered. If you look, in the last 12 years, anemic economic growth of 1–2% was a success story. But you could not build the myth of unlimited economic growth that was the basis of the economic system we had been accustomed to on such a small growth. And we had to recognize that all we had built our economic wealth upon was a myth, because you cannot have unlimited growth with unlimited resources. And this is something we became aware of. This was an idea injected and articulated within the United Nations framework, sustainable development. Our consciousness, our alertness for the resources available, and our responsibility to deal with resources in a multi-generational context. When we came out of 2008, there was first, I mean, in my long life with the United Nations, there were many lessons I draw. Two of the most important ones for my life was first, referring to the topic of today, peace, development, and human rights cannot be separated. They're interconnected. You cannot build one pillar without building the others. There is no peace without sustainable development. There's no sustainable development without peace, and both are built on human rights, inseparable. My second lecture is that every crisis is the result of unsustainable imbalances. We are trying to balance the world. And whenever we lose this balance and the situation tilts, we stumble into a crisis. When the tensions between two countries become unsustainable, there is a war. As long as there are only 600 million people in the world starving, we don't take note. If it's 850, we have a global food crisis. You know, and you can go on with these examples. So our target, and this is the task of the United Nations, is to keep this fragile balance that keeps us from falling into the abyss. It always reminds me of the caricature of this Dutch little boy who holds the dam with one finger. You know, if he puts the finger, we have the flood. So this fragile balance is what I have been struggling for all my professional life. And this is what the United Nations have been struggling for in the last 75 years. In 2008, we became aware that the world has totally changed for us. We're the first generation ever that cannot provide the future generation, our children, with the options to have a better life than we ourselves. It's the first time in human history. Every generation lived better than the previous one, and every generation could build on the expectations to live better than the previous ones. We are the first generation that cannot pass on this heritage to our children. First thing. Second, 2008 also taught us that the most dangerous, most The imbalance with the most profound effects is the imbalance between the economic globalization and the political nationalization. In 2008, we recognized that these financial instruments that dominate the financial world had usurped away the politicians' policy space. Even the leaders of Europe recognized that they have no policy space. So enormous amounts of money were transferred from the middle classes, tax money, to sustain companies that had previously played with 90% or 95% of their assets, but they were too big to fail. So we have become accustomed to bail out irresponsible politics, and our civil society has not taken note. Because one of our weaknesses is the lack of accountability. To hold those who influence our lives accountable to what they have promised when we gave them the votes, and to what very often they were not living up afterwards. So 2008 changed our life. So ever since 2008, I have been trying to see crystallization points, people who tell us the future. Where can we build a new narrative? There were many people who were clairvoyant, great in analytics, but we were not able to create a critical mass to change the direction of the world we live in. Mr. Novak was referring to Piketty and to his work on inequalities. That's another imbalance which has become unsustainable, and which is increasing by the moment. If you look at the reports during the crisis we're going through now, the inequalities are exploding. So, just I don't want to be dark now. I just want to see which is the world we're living in, because suddenly 3 weeks ago the word lockdown. This is the biggest crisis anybody of us has ever experienced. The week before the lockdown, I was in Brazil, helping to install a center of human security in Sao Paulo. Now, there was not much of a crisis in Sao Paulo yet. There were 2 or 3 infected when I left. 3 days later, the word lockdown. Also in Austria, for all of us, the world really, I mean, in an unbelievable way. Tourism, 15% of our economy, 2/3 of the economy of many other countries, stopped. It just stopped. Now, in a society like Austria, wealthy, with strong social safety nets, we were able to absorb this shock. As we were in 2008, by the way. Austria was the country in 2008 that suffered the least of all the global countries from the 2008 crisis, because our social safety nets had made us so resilient that we could keep people in the system and not abandoning them and taking them on when we came out of the crisis. The same we're able to do now. We're able to finance, part-time work. People stay at home and they were paid for not going to work. So we could afford that. Suddenly, by the way, we could afford a lot of things. I'm not a macroeconomist, but I'm very interested in macroeconomics. And when I look at the policy guidance for austerity in the last decades, I'm quite surprised that suddenly there are enormous amounts of money everywhere. I mean, I really don't know where this money is being created. Trillions are created and ejected without accountability, no controls. This money is just taken and thrown into we don't know where, And Ms. Georgieva of the IMF said, I advise you take the money, but keep the receipts. Because we have to work this out afterwards. We also have to come to terms with where the money came from and what we do. But, we're living in a very strange world right now. So here we are merging slowly in Austria. And with our Austrian tendency of repression, we think that the world is okay again. I'm afraid this is a lure. Because in a globalized world, in a globally integrated world, there is no island of health anymore. I don't want to blame neoliberalism for the COVID crisis. But if you look at Italy, it was not the Chinese workers in Italy who spread the virus. It was Italian businessmen who traveled to China after the lockdown that brought the virus back. And in Brazil, the focus today, it was not the millions and millions of workers in the informal sector who can't eat in the evening if they won't work during the day, and who can't isolate because they attend to a room in the evening. It was the jet set, it was the business people who traveled the world and brought the virus back to Brazil. And in America, you know, if you remember the pictures after the lockdown, thousands and thousands of people uncontrolled in the migration areas, no masks, nothing, no tests, spreading the virus, which they brought back from Europe at this time, all over America without any control. So there's no research done yet on the root causes exactly. That will be done, but the indicators are frightening. Anyway, whatever will come, whether there will be a second wave, whether there will be a vaccine, you know, we have to think about what is the world we want to take out of the challenge now. And I think a lot of positive effects too. You know, I took up my new job 2 weeks before the lockdown. They had big plans. You know, I had my appointments at the United Nations in New York, you know, to promote the organizations, to fit it into the UN activities. But all of this was shattered. It was told lockdown. I couldn't even go to a job anymore. You know, we were all unprepared. I didn't have a PC at home. You know, I was working from my laptop, which was not connected to my workstation, and from my iPad for 3 months. But we all found out that we can deal with it, you know, very, very easily. You know, I take away positive lessons. You know, I definitely will fly much less in the future than I did in the past. This is one of the good lessons for me and my family. You know, I was flying around the world like crazy when I was at the United Nations, but it's not necessary anymore. Some face-to-face contact will be necessary, but much can be done virtually. You know, when we are an academic institution, I'm working here I'm leading the International Anti-Corruption Academy. This is a very small organization. It is the only international organization dealing with corruption comprehensively, only with corruption. Now, corruption is something which most people cannot understand and cannot imagine. Corruption is perceived like a dark shadow over our lives, too big to fight, too inconcrete to identify. Where is the line between generous behavior and negligence and criminal behavior? That can only be constituted in each country by the criminal law system. But anyway, but at the same time, corruption siphons away unquantifiable amounts of money every year. It goes into the trillions from productive economies. Money that cannot be compensated in the UN context with official development assistance, nor with direct financial investments, nor by remittances. All of the three dramatically decreasing now in this crisis, in the face of the biggest challenge of the United Nations, implementation of the SDGs. Now, and this is our starting point. You know, when in my years with the United Nations, I was very lucky to work very close to Ban Ki-moon. He always says that I was his closest non-Korean collaborator. And I was a Rio plus 20, and we conceptualized what became the SDGs. And Ban Ki-moon had many achievements, but his two greatest achievements were that he got the SDGs adopted by consensus by the 194 UN countries, and that he got the Paris Agreement adopted. Two deliverables that most people had not believed were possible. So this gives us a great basis for the future. Now, the present Secretary General believes that the biggest challenges of the world are climate change. That stays with us. It doesn't go away. In fact, none of the problems that were here before the crisis will go away or did go away. Many of them exacerbated because we have to find the funds for implementation. So they're still all there, all these threatening issues. And they've exacerbated. Climate change, there's a lure right now because there are no planes and there are people driving less. So it shows that how quickly the world recovers and how resilient it is. I was in Venice the weekend after Italy opened again. The canals were clean. You know, the biggest threat to Venice, the cruise ships that might have been never resolved, were gone. I may be gone forever. You know, so some of the issues resolve themselves. You know, but many stay. climate change will come back. And one other issues come back that we referred to today, also the context of human rights. Movement of people. You know, we are not aware today, we don't think of the millions of children, tens of millions of children in danger today because all our efforts are geared towards COVID and we don't vaccinate children against measles anymore. Children not being vaccinated globally. We don't know how many of them will perish as a side effect of the crisis. No. So we are not living on an island in Austria. We are very privileged here. That we can sit here, that we have an income, that we have nature to go out in isolation, that you could walk in Vienna. You know, all the doors were closed, but at least you could go out. That you didn't have a special permit like in Paris or in Rome and many other cities to go to the closest supermarket for 3 months. So we are extremely privileged here. But we shouldn't be lured because the challenges are waiting and we have to define what do we want to take out of this crisis. Now, my time is running out, so I'm just coming back now to the Vienna issues, you know, which I have a strong passion for. Because at one stage in my career, I was for 6.5 years Austrian permanent representative to the United Nations in Vienna. And that was a very passionate involvement for me. Because I believe in the issues here. You know, the uncivil elements of civil society, trading in human beings, money laundering, drugs, crime in all its forms, justice reform, you know, international criminal law. These are very important issues. But today, if you look at the world, at the United Nations, the United Nations can only deal with the issues that member states bring to the table. You know, the United Nations are the United Nations. They're not the Secretariat. And today, the United Nations, whatever is not in the SDGs is not. You know, the SDGs are such an incredible challenge that we can only possibly focus on the SDGs. And okay, of the Vienna topics, anti-corruption is in the SDGs. Others too, money, trading human beings is largely there, but anti-corruption is at the center of the SDGs. Target 5 SDG 16, which is building structures within which the future of the world can evolve and develop on the basis of the legal state. And the laws, law-based. So this makes what we are doing extremely relevant. And this is why I accepted this position at this time, in spite of the fact that the organization I'm taking over is pretty much insolvent and I don't really know how to pay the salary of my staff at the end of this month. But somebody has to do it. And it is increasingly recognized that anti-corruption is progress in the fight against corruption is a conditio sine qua non for the implementation of the SDGs. We will not be able to raise the money for the implementation of the SDGs if we do not succeed in taming corruption and controlling the illicit financial flows which are connected with corruption and bribery of public officials. So this is increasingly recognized, and the United Nations have invited us as a non-UN organization to participate in the elaboration of the UN common position in the preparation of the special General Assembly on Corruption next April. So that this is a topic which is extremely challenging and which will benefit all of us. Now, if I have 2 more minutes, I just give you a little thing what we are doing, because most of you might not have heard about us. You know, I was one of the negotiators of UNCAC, of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. You know, we started negotiations shortly after I took up my office, and I was, very willing and volunteering to participate. And I was entrusted with negotiating the last chapter, the implementation chapter. Now, this UNCAC, I believe, is a great instrument. And if you really implement it, we tame corruption. But with so many other UN instruments, countries come together, they negotiate a convention, and then they are too exhausted to implement it. So many of the UN wonderful instruments become deadwood. but they're not implemented. So when that happened to UNCAC, in about 2007, I started thinking we need to do something to facilitate implementation of UNCAC. So with a few other partners, I came up with the idea to create a global program against corruption and to institutionalize that an institution which is dependent but within the United Nations to facilitate implementation of the SDGs. To make a long story short, in the middle of the process, Ban Ki-moon called me to New York, so I went to New York. I left the process and I only watched it from the edge of my eye. I came with Ban Ki-moon to the opening conference of what then became IACA, International Anti-Corruption Academy, very different from how we had conceptualized it, but in the course of things becoming many interests cannot be aligned, and anyway. So this IACA was then, instead of within the United Nations, founded in the global capital city of Luxembourg, as an international organization sui generis, with no connection to the United Nations, unfortunately. But what it did was, in the last 10 years, it built up a solid academic standing. It's now an institution of higher education within the Bologna system, and we're the only international organization able to award academic degrees, which makes us a very desired partner for the United Nations system and for the others who cannot do the same. They can award diplomas, but not master's degrees. So we're the only organization that is awarding. We are running 2 master's programs in anti-corruption, one more academic, one more practical, for global managers, which were totally closed down. 3 months ago, I arrived there. In my first meeting with my team, I said, what you're doing is great, but it sounds great to have 3,000 alumni in 161 countries. But that's nothing. We have to scale up. We have to have 100,000 alumni in the whole world. Because in the future, every diplomat, every future manager of the international system, every future manager of the global economy needs to have some anti-corruption education to be able to judge what he or she is doing, to judge and to evaluate ethical behavior. Every company is trying to raise the standards of its own culture against corruption, compliance culture. So this is our second pillar. We help global companies to improve their own culture of compliance, because people are increasingly recognizing that corruption is a cancer. It destroys everything and everybody. It doesn't benefit anybody. It only benefits the perpetrator if he can count on impunity. And this is our main role. We help people from the world, traditional personnel, people from all different fields, with technical assistance, to improve their own capacities, to strengthen their criminal law systems in their own countries, to fight corruption more efficiently, and to exclude impunity. So this is my new job, and hopefully my contribution to a better world in the years to come. And I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. So you indeed said we are blessed. We are sitting in an air-conditioned room. There is still a possibility to travel. We have partners and friends coming from the at least neighboring countries. One of the partners, which I missed to mention this morning, are our friends from Brașov, from Kronstadt in Germany, you would say, who came also simply by traveling. So it becomes at least in a way some optimistic. Before we start with the we here in plenary, we will have a gastro tour, which is kindly provided by a famous guest house, Viennese guest house, Vienna. Before that, we will still stay a bit, if you don't mind, with the questions and answers. We have many questions also coming from via net. Maybe question for Steve Clements. I know he loves spicy questions. One of the spicy questions that came from Hong Kong. We have Steve there. He's listening.
I'm here.
Okay, Steve, hello. How are you?
Very warm. I peaked up when I heard the ice cream.
Okay, so greetings from Vienna. Professor Nowak is also here. So the question is actually two little questions, but it comes to one. So one is, do we need to deter or to stop China? And is it possible without Russia? It comes from Hong Kong to you. Sorry.
Well, no, not at all. What I would respond is you know, I want to, first of all, I appreciate everything I heard. I assume that my video recorded comments came earlier. I would say that's a complex question because I am one that's become pretty cynical on whether there's a global commons, even a transatlantic commons today. And so when you talk about, can we take on China, or can, you know, the question is, who is we, and is there a we? I don't think there is right now. Maybe we'll, you know, see after the next election whether there's enough trust and common purpose between, you know, other global stakeholders on whether China's rise makes sense or not. But otherwise, you're faced with what Ian Bremmer calls a G0 world. And I think in a G0 world, the question really is, does the United States want to see a rise of China? Does Europe want to see a rise of China? But do Europe and America see the world the same way? So I don't think that the premise of the question makes sense given the geostrategic realities we see today. And I don't see a bond with Russia as being one that will be any easier to create because of a concern about China.
Okay, thanks. So maybe from the audience, next question. Try to be precise, and it goes to any of the speakers. And don't be shy also. Yes, please. Maybe you just come to here to microphone, or the other side. Just so our audience from the...
Yeah, okay, good. Take it like that. So Grauenberg from Institute of the Danube Region. I have a question actually to Professor Belinka. We have today 75 years of Europe's collective security. Now, you mentioned that our current Minister of Defense was not much talking about Europe or the European defense. I think the problem may be deeper in a way that the European dimension is often neglected and the European idea. So what do you think could be done about this rising problem with our nations within EU, ever more nationalistic but less European in a way? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Professor, well, if you can be brief. Maybe
yes,
2 minutes.
Of course, it's an Austrian aspect and the European aspect. The Austrian aspect is that Austria defines itself as a permanent neutral country, belongs to the small number of EU members which are not NATO members. This creates a specific defense, security, and foreign policy position, which has allowed Austria to pay, compared with the economic possibilities, the least amount on defense spending. Austria is underfinancing its defense instruments for decades. It's not a question of the present government. It has been gone on over the years because we are neutral and we don't have an enemy. But we should have a friend, and this is the European Union. We should be part of the European Union. And of course, then comes in the pan-European dimension. And by the way, I consider Brexit as a possibility to strengthen the European Union. Because the main factor why the common foreign and security policy has not been implemented was not Austria. Austria is too small. It was the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom has been always non-interested at all to see the European Union as an actor in the common foreign and security policy, because it was a special relationship to the United States, which put all the interest in NATO and not in the EU. Without the United Kingdom, it would become easier to implement some aspects of the European common foreign and security policy. So I think for the deepening of the European Union, Brexit could become a very good factor. Thank you.
Thank you. So since we are really out of time and we have to finish with the live streaming 6 o'clock, that implies that other two panels which are coming after lunch have to start precise on time like a Japanese train. I would suggest 30 seconds conclusion or concluding remarks starting with Professor Novak, who is also waiting us on Zoom, and other two panelists in the room. So Professor Novak, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here still.
If you can kindly, for 30 seconds, just to sum up.
I think it was a very interesting discussion because it has touched upon so many different issues, economic policies, EU integration, but also the history of the United Nations, human rights, and security policies. And I would think, of course, although the world is in disarray, as the title of this conference shows us, I think there are many positive things. We have to remain thinking positively. The Sustainable Development Goals is positive. Tony Bellinger just has said, let's see the Brexit positive. And I think it's right. For the European integration, for building a new and stronger European Union, I think perhaps it's a good way. And there are also other positive so we should learn also from the situation in COVID-19 that if we work together, we are stronger and we might perhaps be able to tackle the main challenges, and that is definitely the global climate crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much. Now, other two panelists in the room. Professor Zeno, please.
Yeah, I mean,
30 seconds, you have to sum up.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad to see that we are, I mean, we talked about many things, but we are on the same page on some issues, at least some of us. And I started by talking about US-China relations, then strategy, and then the state, given that there was a question on China earlier on. So I just wanted to say that China is another example of strategic oversight. We realized about the rise of China too late, whether we like China or not. That's a fact. But also we are learning something for China in terms of a more powerful state. I mean, what we see with Donald Trump in the United States as well, and his more authoritarian style, in a way goes, I think there is an understanding that the advantage of China was to have a more centralized political control. And I think that's the kind of direction that the US is taking with Trump in some areas. And so I think I've kind of touched on the right points, really. I mean, I just highlight again that these are the main takeaway points. A more intervention in state and a long-term view for the future.
Thank you. Thank you. Ambassador?
Thank you very much.
30 seconds, yeah, as a sum up.
Yes, please, 30 seconds. Thank you. We need to be positive. We need to move on with the world. In spite of the total disruption of global assembly, which we're experiencing now, we have the way to find to compensate it. I'm very happy that Professor Novak is also seeing the world positively in spite of the threat on human rights that we experience globally everywhere. And I think this is something we need to overcome. Because here I see the global consensus falling apart. And the usual, the well-known supporters of the system are disappearing. Hopefully the pendulum is only swinging wildly to one side. It might come back, but here I find institutional weakness. I will not be with you in the afternoon because I'm participating in a global high-level panel, FACTI panel, on transparency, integrity, and accountability, the three issues I've referred to in the United Nations. This panel is also trying to help preparing for UNGAS, for the special General Assembly on corruption. And we are trying to find ways to increase public income by limiting illicit financial flows, from bribery and corruption. And this panel, we have another virtual session at 2 o'clock. We have every day, we have a 3-hour virtual session with people on 5 continents participating, and I will be in front of my computer at 2 o'clock, so please excuse me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and thanks also for our audience for being patient. We stayed a little bit over the time. We will have anyway a break up to 2 o'clock for the digital audience. Unfortunately, they won't enjoy our socializing and food, but they would have some clips and addresses from our partners. Let us start at 2 o'clock, but before finally closing, what came as an idea, and I'm sorry that we didn't have more time to engage and interact with the audience, and I'm sure that far more questions and the comments were around. What we are already thinking to do, as Ambassador said, we all somehow accustomed now to new realities of sitting on a laptop on our, let's say, couch. So what we are thinking is to have practically each and every panelist one-on-one in one of the digital sessions that we can offer to universities around and to our partners. So this is just for the time being telling goodbye, but we will soon see each other. And once more applause for our speakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you.